Hi everyone and welcome. In this video I'm making a gender reveal cake with some sprinkles inside. So to create that cavity I'm using a cookie cutter. I'm going to line up my sponges one on top of the other to make sure that my holes are even and not lopsided. And I'm just going to punch out the middle of both of my tiers. This is a 5-inch cake, and so my cookie cutter is about 2.5 inches wide. You want to make sure you don't go too large because you want your cake to still have some structure in it. Next, I'm putting some frosting down and attaching my bottom layer of my cake, and then I'm going to fill my cake with more frosting. As you can see, I'm being pretty careful. I want to just cover the outside edge of the cake and not go in the middle. If you go in the middle, your sprinkles will stick to the inside buttercream, which I don't want that to happen. I want the sprinkles to have a nice dramatic effect. So once I have a nice even layer of frosting, and I'm going to add my second layer on top, flipping the cake over so the flattest part of the cake is facing upwards to give me a nice flat edge. Now I have all these nice fun sprinkles. They're blues and grays to give it, and some white to give it some nice dimension. I also have some like cichlids in there that are like chocolatey, so lots of fun flavor. And I'm just going to make sure all my sprinkles are inside. And then I'm going to use one of my cake holes to like plug up the top just to make sure everything is nice and secure. I'm then filling in the gap of my sponges with some more frosting and then doing a crumb coat. So for a crumb coat, you want to just coat your cake with some buttercream or frosting just to make sure that all the crumbs stay locked in with this cake. For my crumb coat, I start at the top and then work my way down to the sides all the way down to the bottom of the cake. And usually when you're doing a crumb coat, you would want to get a separate bowl with buttercream because you don't want any crumbs to go back into your bowl of all of your buttercream. You want to make sure that all your crumbs stay either with the cake or in a separate bowl. That being said, I'm being really careful with this to only put my crummy buttercream in like the one corner of my bowl. Also, this cake is a practice cake that's just for me, and so I'm not super concerned if there's any crumbs that get into my buttercream. With the crumb coat done, it's time to pop this into the freezer for at least 10 minutes or so to get everything nice and set. Moving on to prepping my bags. So for this cake, I am doing a vintage style, which means I want to have a lot of piping tips. Therefore, I'm prepping both of my bags with couplers. Using couplers allows me to use kind of an infinite number of piping tips for my vintage style cake without really wasting any frosting. And because I have like 18-inch bags, I'm also going to cut them down because I don't have that much frosting. For this design, I use round tips, star tips, and petal tips, and I will leave all the numbers in the description box below. Now that my cake is set, I'm going to go back with my top coat of frosting, and I chose to go with a white base because I want this cake to be pretty neutral aside from the colors I'm adding to it, which are going to be blue and pink. And I'm covering this the same way I covered my cake for the crumb coat, so starting at the top, leveling out that top, and then working my way down the sides to the bottom of the cake. And then I like to go back and add more frosting to the top of my cake because I know that I always miss the top of my cake for some reason. I always have less frosting. And so now I'm using a bench scraper to just smooth out those sides. When smoothing out my sides, I tend to prefer a bench scraper versus a palette knife. And that's just because this bench scraper, I can get really clean, like 90-degree angles, versus a palette knife, I tend to angle mine a little bit inwards. So my cakes are always a little trapezoidal without using the bench scraper. As I use my bench scraper, I am kind of opening up some air pockets in the buttercream. I'm just going back and filling those in. I'm also pulling out any lumps that I see. So my buttercream, because this cake is for myself, it sat on my counter. It's shelf stable, but it sat on my counter for probably 3 to 4 days. And so it got a little crusty and a little hard in places. And so I also didn't re-whip it with a machine. I whipped it by hand. And so there were some chunks in there that I was just pulling out of my cake. Again, this cake was just for me as a practice cake. If this were a cake for somebody, I would not have done this. My sides look pretty smooth. Now time to go back and straighten out my top. As you can see, I don't hold my palette knife completely flat, so when I do my edges, I end up having a bit of a pyramid shape on my top. So I have more buttercream in the middle and it kind of slopes down to my sides. I've noticed with a couple of my cakes, and how I really should fix this is that I should put my cake in the fridge with the excess buttercream over the top and then use a knife to kind of cut my edges down instead of having a sloping edge. Again, this cake is for practice, so it's not going to bother me, but for future cakes, I will probably adjust how I do that. Now it's time to take the remaining buttercream, split it in two, and dye them my colors. So I'm going to dye the first one sky blue, and the second one deep pink. So actually, for this one, I used a fuchsia because I couldn't find my deep pink, and it turned it a little more purpley than I wanted it to. And so instead of adding more fuchsia, I decided to find my deep pink and add a drop of deep pink to really give it that pink color. Unfortunately, the pink doesn't show up very well on my camera, but I promise you it's not this pastel. You'll see at the very end or towards the end of my cake that it does actually look pink. Once I've given my pink a thorough mixture, it's time to move on to my blue. So I'm grabbing another spatula or a spoon, I'm going to mix in my color, and as you can see, this turned out a very bright blue. And it's weird because the pink is probably the same shade, but you can't tell in my camera. But once you put the colors on the cake, they actually blend really nicely together. So I'm going to caveat the next section by saying this entire part was a big mistake and I actually ended up completely scrapping it and pulling it off the cake. But I wanted to leave this in the video because a lot of people just post their perfect cakes and they don't talk about the process it takes them to get the cake. As I went to an art class, I said they called this kind of the hot mess phase. So I'm going to show you my hot mess phase to show you that, no one's perfect and that even though I've been doing cakes for about 3 years now, we still make mistakes. So with that, if you want to skip this, jump down to the time codes, I'll tell you where my actual decoration begins. So my mistake really stems from not using a stencil to section out my cake. I thought I could just use my palette knife to create 6 equal sections on my cake and then freehand pipe semicircles with my ruffles, with my 104 tip to make ruffles, and that I would have this really awesome design. And the ruffles are so lopsided and uneven that when I go to pipe this next blue border, it just looks bad. Like I can't even describe it. It looks very choppy and I can't get a straight line and everything just looked completely awful. However, I kept going because I thought I could fix it without having to redo the whole thing. And so this is actually, you can see one of the reasons why it's important to work on a cold cake, because I can actually pull off the frosting using a knife or whatever tool you feel comfortable with and not have it impact my white. Unfortunately though, it's now becoming like 90 degrees here in Tucson, and so my cake, while it was cold, was defrosting very, very rapidly, and so by the end of my 5 minutes, my cake was soft to the touch, the entire thing. It ended up working out in my favor, but I would suggest if you live in a hot climate like I do, go for chilling your cakes longer. So maybe go for 15 minutes or 30 minutes. Don't just stop at 10. Also, I would say maybe work on a cold cake, not just trying to set the outer layer. So usually I work on frozen solid cakes because it sets the icing really nicely. For this, I left my cake out overnight, so it was very, very soft. And so it wasn't cooling like it normally does, because usually it's cooling from the inside and the outside when we put it back in the freezer. But with this, it was just cooling from the outside, and so it just wasn't working all around. So as you can see, it looks like a child did this cake, and I was so upset and so frustrated and that I just couldn't get it together and nothing was looking right. And so I decided to scrap it and scrape all of it off. I think it worked in my favor though, because it actually gave me this really cool watercolor, as you can see. And so I decided to kind of roll with that. Instead of having a completely white cake, just go back and add in some, pinks and some blues to give it a little bit of a watercolor effect to just kind of tie it all in. And I think it actually looked pretty nice. So making it work, and this is actually, because my cake wasn't cold, I could do this. If my cake was cold, this would be like tearing the cake apart. And so this is like the one positive of my cake not being completely frozen, is that I could fix it, I guess, is I could, adjust my cake and make it work. I will say at this point, I am very happy this is a practice cake and not for anyone, because if it was for someone, I would be very frustrated, or even more frustrated, because usually I do my cakes the day before and I only have a limited amount of time. However, I went back to what I know. So I have done one vintage cake before, and I used a cookie cutter like this one to make my circles, and so I went back to that again. This is going to help me pipe ruffles that actually are smooth enough for me to then do a nice blue border on top of them. So as you can see, they look a little better. Again, they're not going to be perfect, but I thought this looked a lot better and helped me just have the design I was looking for. I also took a step back and actually froze my cake. So this was in the freezer for at least half an hour, so it had a super cold cake from the inside and the outside, which means I could scrape off mistakes like this one. I could scrape off this mistake and not ruin that white layer. You will notice I am taking breaks. As I mentioned before, I had some weird chunks in my buttercream, and so unfortunately those chunks were appearing in my piping tips. And so I had to take a break every now and again to clear out my tip. And I'm not super sure where those chunks came from. Again, I think it was because one was crusty, but also I heated up my buttercream in the microwave, and I think I separated it, so when I added it back in, it just kind of solidified. So again, practice cakes are this is what it's for. It's for experimentation and for learning and just getting things, messing up and trying again. So If this cake were for someone else, different story, but I digress. To cover all those joints, I went through with an open star tip and piped a rosette, and I think this really tied the look all together. So I'd say it's really important if you're doing a vintage style cake to figure out how to cover those joints. To add a bit more detail, I am piping just some dots to kind of make my cake look not so bare in the middle, and I'm piping them to be, large to small. Now it's time to finish the bottom of my cake, and I'm going to do a shell border I'm using a closed star tip here. I usually use an open star tip, but I forgot I'd use that for the pink, so I had to use the closed star. I should mention that when doing a vintage style cake, it's really important to start from the top, because if I were to do the shell border first, and then if I dropped icing from my ruffles, let's say, I'd have to redo my ruffles and my shell. So you want to start from the top down to make sure that if you drop anything, you're not ruining your entire cake. But now to the top of my cake, I'm just doing some rope borders in blue, then in pink, and then I'm going to do a pearl border in blue just to kind of make sure that I'm kind of even on my colors. Pop this in the fridge for a good 15 minutes and then pipe a shell border on top of it using my pink. Vintage style is all about layering texture, so I think this second shell border is really important. But with that, my cake is done. Time for the big reveal. And that was super anticlimactic because I had the cake facing the wrong way. But that being said, I'm so glad you guys made it to the end of this video. If you liked this video or want to see more of my content, you guys know what to do. I do post every second and fourth Friday of the month. And so I hope to see you guys in the next video.